Hello and good day to everyone joining us from all across the world. On behalf of the Academy, I'm Praveen Chopra, and it's my privilege to welcome you to yet another session of the Conversations with the Academy. Now, it's a moment of introspection that all of us have encountered at some point during our professional journeys, asking the existential question, what is our why? What is our ikigai? What is our life's worth? Next slide, Kit. And social scientists have long proposed that professional identity development is essential in the education of health professionals. Social purpose and belonging empowers individuals to behave confidently and is associated with both career commitment and workplace satisfaction. More instructive is the evidence supporting boundary crossing learning with peers actually promotes the integration of the professional self with the personal self, bolstered by a sense of integrity and feelings of self-worth oriented towards providing community-based care. Even at the institutional level, disruptive transformation is emphasizing that purpose matters, and corporations are able to harness, or the corporations that are able to harness the power of purpose to drive performance and profitability enjoy a distinct competitive edge. Now, as we reflect on the confluence of myriad factors that could contribute to a sense of purpose and the formation of self-identity and pride, as professionals in the medical landscape and the consequential influences on career, path progression, and we are fortunate to have a very distinguished faculty today sharing their perspective with us. But before we launch into the discussion, some notes on housekeeping today. We will follow a usual conversational format. We have over 80 registrants today showing the interest in the topic, and the audience could challenge the faculty with questions in the Q&A box in real time. Look out for the poll questions, and the session is being recorded, which will be made available for on-demand viewing on the Academy website later. Next slide, Kit, and now please allow me the pleasure of introducing our faculty. Dr. Paul Benninger is Associate Professor of Public Health and Community Medicine at Tufts University School of Medicine, where he's the director of the MD MBA and the MBS MBA programs. Paul's career experience spans over 3 decades, from his early training as a physician, as a regulator, and as a member of the Senior Executive Service in the US FDA, in leadership roles in the biopharmaceutical industry, including overseeing pharmacovigilance at Merck and Genzyme, and garnering a Master in Business Administration or good measure along the way. He's also, he's a mentoring member of the academic community today, and a mission that I've had the benefit of observing in the recent days that I've got to know Paul better. Paul has published and presented extensively on regulatory policy and on drug development sciences. He's the editor on pharmacovigilance and pharmacoepidemiology for clinical therapeutics, and a member of the Tufts Clinical and Translational Science Institute. Paul is also a fellow of the American College of Physicians and the Infectious Disease Society of America. Lovely to have you with us, Paul, today. And now, Dr. Antonio Tatarani. He is the Chief Medical Officer at PepsiCo, championing the company's global scientific research efforts to establish recommendations and a future roadmap enabling disruptive product innovations, which is aligned with PepsiCo's Hold Your Breath, Winning with Purpose agenda. As a member of the PepsiCo's leadership team, he spearheads the Corporate Life Sciences Strategy and the R&D's Fellow Program as its executive sponsor. Antonio has held several strategic leadership roles within the global pharmaceutical industry, most recently at Sanofi as Senior Vice President and Head of Global Medical Affairs for the Cardiovascular and Diabetes Business Unit, a capacity in which I've had the personal privilege of witnessing his passion, and dare I add, his provocative perspectives. In an earlier avatar, Antonio headed the Obesity, Diabetes, and the Energy Metabolism Unit, also at the US National Institute of Health, and he has been a director of its Clinical Research Center. An endocrinologist by training and an avid researcher, Antonio has been conferred with international recognition and numerous accolades as a widely published author and presenter as well, and for his extensive contributions to the cause of research and development. Thank you both for sharing your journey with us, and indeed with your expansive expertise and experience. Both you, Paul, and Antonio bring a unique confluence of purposeful professionalism intersecting with entrepreneurship to today's intriguing conversation. Delighted to have you with us too, Antonio. And now over to you, Paul.
Great, thank you, Praveen. Well, good day to all of you, wherever you are in the world. All right, next slide. We're going to start with a poll. And with these three true-false questions, I'll use them as a basis for my discussion and then circle back to close at the end. So great, thanks, Kit. And if you could all answer these for yourself.
Actually, Paul, you've raised some very important, while they're answering this, the important parameters of where directions take us, what our life journey tells us all about, and where do we find our why. So thank you for putting this into perspective. And Kit, let us know when the audience has triggered in.
All right.
There we go. Kit, we can close it for now. Yeah.
Great.
Wonderful.
Excellent. All right. So you are now prepared to hear what we have to say. Next slide, please. And we'll put this aside. All right, this is a very brief summary of my experience. And the first lesson that you would take away from this is that I've done a number of very different things over the 3+ decades, going on 4 decades actually now, of activities and experiences. And the second thing is that my background and training in infectious diseases, internal medicine, infectious diseases, is actually critical to all of these. So they were actually played out in very different ways depending upon the environment, in government, in industry, and in academia. Next slide, please. So now to the lessons. We have 3 lessons here. The first is that there is a shortage of talent. This is the overwhelming concern of chief executive officers in industry today, really across all sectors. There's a substantial shortage of talent. That means that the opportunities for workers are plentiful, but it also means that the career paths that people take are very likely going to be circuitous and not infrequently serendipitous. There's going to be opportunities, but it's very often what you see as opportunities in terms of the kinds of things that you think you can do. Next slide, please. Second lesson is that you really need to take full responsibility for your careers in a way that's expansive. In the more traditional way in past decades, people were staying in a relatively narrow area. They had their few acquaintances. They saw opportunities in a narrow sense, depending upon what their education and training was. Today, it is much, much broader. So you have to really take the time to think about what the perimeter is. What are those outside boundaries of the things that you're willing to entertain? Next slide. That then is the third lesson, to broaden your pool of opportunity. Think about how you might reinvent yourself regularly as a strategic imperative throughout your career. And some of those may be really significantly different than from what you did before. Next slide, please. So this is a building slide, so we'll just do the first part. Great, thank you. So as we look out in our daily experiences, we see the headlines that tell us about different organizations. And as we take time, we realize the type of things they do, the groups of people who work there, the silos, and the subparts of the organization. And then with more experience, we begin to understand and connect with individuals, often in our social environments. And we find out where people work, and we learn about the kinds of things that they're doing. All right, another click, please. But what we do purposefully is begin with ourselves and understand the kinds of things that are our interests. And then we begin to learn our relationships with others, and then understand how they fit into the larger organization, which will segue to the next slide. So on the left, this is just a verbal description of the graphic that we had on the previous slide about learning about yourself, your personality style, your engagement style, and what your strengths and interests are, and the values that underlie all of those. Then as we move up and relate to others, we begin to think about what our network is, learning about others and the ways we can do that, learning from others. And that's about mentoring and coaching. And they're very different skill sets, but we really do want to have a number of mentors and coaches to help us throughout our lives. And then finally, it's learning to work with others. These are critical skills. These are the soft skills of learning how to function in team environments. Right side here, I take this idea from Praveen, who talked about the virtuous cycle. And we start with our life experiences that inform our interests and passions that shape our purpose. And it's our purpose then that drives our education and training. And we realize that these are going to be lifelong experiences. It's not just a one-off or one-time experience. We're going to be continuing to learn over our lives. And we see how our education and training shapes our identity. And as we mature, this begins to inform our purpose, and then so it goes. Next slide. All of our different experiences help shape who we are. There are opportunities for us to learn. Our academic success and athletic success, we're all familiar with, but so is failure. Failure is a very important teacher. One, about resilience, but also about how we can relate to others and how we can grow from that. Mental illness, physical illness, and injury, people can use those as platforms, and people do that. They start institutes and they start nonprofit organizations. So sometimes they're career changers. Prejudice. Great story in the paper the other day about Michael Cox, who's the new police chief of Boston. 25 years ago, when he was a plainclothes police officer in pursuit of a suspect, he was mistaken by his uniformed colleagues as one of those perpetrators and was actually attacked by them. And he could have been very bitter with that experience, but he learned from it and eventually moved into the upper ranks of the organization and is now coming back to be the police chief. Poverty and privation. One of my students in the MD MBA program is a Syrian and was actually one of those people that was going across country in Eastern Europe. And his experience could have made him also very bitter, but he has a much broader view of it. And he too is thinking about what type of nonprofit that he wants to be involved in when he's done with his MD and MBA training. Next slide, please. So now we circle back to the polling questions. So I would venture to say that career paths are almost never a straight line. And it's critical to take charge of your career so that you can begin to shape what that's going to look like. Your professional and educations and training do not prepare you for careers in industry. That's why you're here. That's why there is the academy. That's why there are these experiences, because medical schools, professional schools of all sorts have done actually a very poor job of preparing students and then trainees for careers in industry and actually in other areas as well. The last question about professionals in the pharmaceutical industry have a huge number of opportunities. It's how you limit yourself. It's how expansive you put your perimeter and how you think about what those potential opportunities are. Next slide. So that brings me to one of my favorite closing quotes here from T.S. Eliot. And that concludes my comments. Next slide.
Great. So thank you, Paul. I think you have raised some very, very fundamental questions, and we're going to move to Antonio in a second. But some questions are trickling in. Let me start off with one which is a particularly challenging one, which has just come from Honorio, and I have a second one lined up quickly. In your opinion, you've already seen, you've followed a varied career path, and your career path depends both upon the organization you belong to and the country that you come from. You've given some examples of your own students coming from different countries. Now, is the sense of purpose internal? Is it innate? Or is it the main driver that takes you through your professional life? I knew Honorio would ask a needling question, but this is a gem. Go for it.
That's the nature-nurture question. I think they're highly interactive. I think there are some inherent aspects to who you are, but it's highly interdependent with what your experiences are and what you do with them. There's also the other related expression, it takes a village to raise a child. It takes all of your experiences to become who you are. And some of them can be just game changers. Some of them can just totally reshape who you are and where you go. It can be loss of a family member. It could be a physical disability. Could be anything. I think as we age, we see these stories in the paper all the time, and we recognize that the constitution that the person had helped inform them decide what they wanted to do.
Great, and I think Honorio's question does lay the framework of as we seek where we belong. So it's a great one. And then a quick corollary has come up here. And then this Louise is asking, how does a sense of purpose reconcile with the constant transformation that's taking place in the industry today? And I can see Antonio nodding his head, and I would like to bounce this question to you, Antonio, even before you start your presentation. So Paul, first you, and then Antonio.
I'll pass on.
Antonio, would you like to take a stab at this?
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question because at some point during the types of careers that we represent and we are describing, there is a collision of ethics, moral standards and compass with commercial pressures. And there are obviously, when you transition from academia to the private sector, which Paul and I have done, and it's one of the themes that we are exploring this morning, and we may want to go deeper. There is a question of whether you're joining an organization that wants to succeed in the marketplace, which is part of how Western capitalism works, but whether or not those organizations are trying to have that success in the name of a purpose. And I think, at least in my career, that has been the reconciling factor in making some of the choices. Now, that assumes that you can make a choice of the organization where you go and work given where you are with your career at that point. But for me, it's been very comforting to ask that question at the moment where I had to make decision about transitions. Am I joining an organization that has a clear purpose beyond making money? And it's, surprisingly, that's a very easy question to answer. And if you're true to what you feel in your heart, then the decision of whether to joining or not is an easy one.
So there are two parts there. One, as Antonio said, is in your heart. There is that sense, there's that feeling as you talk to people, as you meet them, and even as you see the physical plant. There's all this part about culture. That goes way back. You get to see it in the physical plant and the people you talk to, and how they interact with one another. So you get a very gut level feeling for it. So and you see it in there today. I guess you would say the website, but it's the mission, vision, and values. What does the company hold sacred, and how do they talk about it and support it? So that's really key. And then I think that the last point is that we all have our own moral compasses, and we serve as a moral compass to the institutions that we're joining. So it's our decisions, especially the higher up you go, we're looked at, and the decisions we make and how we interact with others are observed. And those lessons are internalized. So there's as much of that goes from us. We're not just wallflowers looking at what's going on here. We're actually part of it. And that's, I think we play critical roles as we move up the organization.
Great. I think both of you brought in that point about taking it and moving it forward in a leadership role that we have to bring in each of our facets. So excellent. So why don't we transition and bring in, Antonio, your viewpoints as we go along, and then we'll come back to some of the questions coming in again. So Antonio, some reflections on the path less taken.
Yes. Thank you. First of all, thank you, Pravin, and the Academy for inviting me. It's really an honor and a privilege to be sharing the podium with Paul. And it's fantastic that the three of us, maybe that's not completely by accident, have crossed paths professionally. So when we say the things that we say, we can check each other out for truthness and authenticity. So that's a good situation to have going, and hopefully what we say, it's useful for the 30 or so people that have joined today. So hi to all. So I have a couple of questions as well, just to get us going. So if we can go to the next slide, I believe they are next, and launch the poll. And while you're trying to answer these questions, although I've been trained to stay quiet to allow you to concentrate and find your answers to the question. I will say a couple of things as a matter of disclosure. First of all, Paul and I have had relatively successful careers, as you have heard. So transition through multiple industries and multiple organizations. And I'll tell you very briefly my own experience in a moment. But I pass absolutely no moral or practical judgment on the fact that is the only way to achieve success. In fact, we could have panelists, and maybe it's a suggestion for Pravin as a contrast to this conversation, to have a couple of people that have stayed very narrow in their field and have achieved equal or greater success than Paul and I combined. And I have great admiration for those people, because the second disclosure I will make, I have no patience for staying narrow focused for any long period of time. So it's in my own nature to be curious. And I feel a constant drive, it's almost a curse, to wanting to explore more and more and more of what surrounds one's professional career. And the last disclosure, which I don't know if you're ready to see the polls here, is these 3 questions were a way of, yeah, beautiful. It's a little bit spread out, which is good, because there is no right question, obviously, no right answer to those questions. The other thing was with these 3 questions to get out of, knowing that Paul would go in front of me and cover most of the hardcore aspects of this conversation. So I knew that I had a tough act to follow. But the questions that I raised have to do with perhaps softer aspects of how one's career developed, and maybe they are not even specific to this particular line of work. And you can read them the following way. Are you aware, as you develop your career, of your surroundings? You're never alone once you join small or large organizations. You're always a part of an environment where you have stakeholders. And it so happens, for example, in pharma and in the food and beverage business where I'm in right now, that the commercial side of the organization is an important driving force of the success of the company that you belong. So are you capable at some level to speak the same language as the rest of the organization, and especially in terms of commercial? Also, it's, and I say that this with the utmost respect for those that don't choose that path, but it's very difficult in large organization to be a lone wolf. What happens if you find yourself in that role is that even at the highest level, you command perhaps a lot of respect, but you finally an internal consultant to the organization. And if you're comfortable with that role, that's absolutely fine. But to be quote unquote successful at large in large organizations, you have to be a people person. And because organizations thrive on the relationship between managers and people that are managed by them, at some point you will be tested on whether or not you are a good manager. And so how you hone in those skills, it's also very important. And the third one can be read in many different ways, but in my particular case, is are you aware of where your heart really is within the context of your profession? For example, in my case, so I'll go very briefly through my professional experience. As Praveen said, I started my career 3 years out of medical school at the National Institutes of Health as a special volunteer. Initially, I came with a luggage and a little bit of money from my father, and then worked my way up to become one of the directors of one of the clinical research centers. But that's not the point. The point is that was a very important initial transition from what I had been perhaps expected to do, which was practice clinical medicine, and I had become an endocrinologist with a subspecialty in diabetes, et cetera, to sending out the first signal that I wasn't comfortable in taking only that role. And the real intellectual challenge for me at the time, having started a few clinics, was the realization that I could spend my entire professional life helping one patient at a time, and cumulatively, maybe I would have helped a few thousands people once it was all done. But I had my mind opened up by a series of initial experience to the fact that there is a way to help at a larger scale. And here is the theme of my question: how large is the scale at which you may want to try to provide some kind of contribution to knowledge and lessening of human suffering. And finally, my realization is that the largest is at the prevention level. And that's how I end up where I am today. So I spent 11 years at the NIH trying to figure out the mechanisms through which, pathophysiological or otherwise molecular, through which people become obese and eventually diabetic, having a wonderful research collaboration with a Native American tribe down there in southwestern Arizona of the Pima Indians that unfortunately have had and continue to have the world record of obesity and type 2 diabetes, and did that somewhat successfully for 10 years. But then I realized that, and again, this is very personal, that run in my own mind its own course, in the sense of saying, yeah, okay, we will, we have contributed to the understanding of how this disease come about, but how do we fix them? And that was the motor in my mind to seek out a second career in the pharma industry. Now, just to tell you how complicated it is to follow your dreams, I tell you that my first foray in the pharma industry was at Merck Pharmaceuticals here in the US. And they had hired me because they had a very promising program on an anti-obesity drug, which was closed down the night before my first day at work. So I went there, and I still remember my good mentor and friend Jonathan Tobert coming into the office with the face like a ghost, saying, "Antonio, do you want the good news or the bad news?" And I thought he was sick, and I said, "Sit down. I mean, whatever you want, give me whatever news you want." And he said, "Yeah, I mean, we're very happy. The good news is that we're very happy to have you. The bad news is that we have killed the obesity program. So you're going to be working on lipid-lowering drugs," which I had not done one bit at NIH. It was furthest from my interests as it can be. But just to give you an example of what Paul was saying, how this thing can be very non-linear. But then, to make a long story short, Merck, then Sanofi, and I did contribute to the development and bringing to the marketplace of successful and unsuccessful drugs. So my claim to fame in the pharma industry is to have been the scientific face of one of the initial most promising anti-obesity drugs that was never approved by the FDA. It was approved in Europe. And we had to take that drug off the market a few months after the encounter with the FDA. So those are the kind of professional episodes that forge you greatly. So pharma industry, and again, a nagging feeling that, after 12 years of doing that, again, very good drugs that improve the lives of a few thousands to a few million people. But when you are in the field of chronic metabolic diseases, as I've been all my entire career, then you realize that to really make an impact at a population level, you have to be working on a solution that is extremely democratic, that is low cost, low tech, and low cost. And then that's how I closed the circle. And at the end of my career, now I joined the one of the largest food and beverage companies that reaches the life of a billion and a half people every 24 hours. So that's the denominator I have the pleasure and the responsibility to deal with on a daily basis. And obviously you realize that with that denominator, anything that we do as an organization to make our portfolio of products, which is, up for discussion, whether it's really in the scope of healthy eating, but to make that portfolio more permissible by reducing sugar content, by reducing sodium content, by reducing fat content at a population level with that denominator is probably going to be the greatest contribution of my entire career to public health. Voila. So I closed the circle there. So I think with between Paul and I have been able to cover a little bit the hard aspects of the career of people that are interested in exploring multiple fields within this, having a degree in medicine allows you to explore. And this is, by the way, by no means comprehensive, because there are so many other directions that I will never get to explore that I could have if I wanted to. But my final message, if I can use a little bit my experience and what I've had to go through, is first and foremost, and again, this is true of, I believe, of any career, really follow your passion, which is another way to say follow your heart, because whatever thing you do, however successful you are, or however much money you make or don't make, in the morning you have to wake up and go do that thing that you do. And if you do it with authenticity because it's the thing that you love to do more than anything else, people around you sense it and lift you in doing what you're doing. The contrary, which I have experienced at time in my career, and I've seen most importantly in colleagues that struggle with what they do, is not good. And so take yourself out of this situation as quickly as you possibly can. The other thing, because we are talking about careers that are based on exploration of multiple fields, I want to give you perhaps one warning, and that is mind the transitions. Okay, mine are quite important. So from the government to the pharma industry at that time, people that observed you would say you had gone to the dark side. What did that mean? How much did that weigh on my initial approach to how to reposition myself from an academic expert to somebody who was basically an apprentice in a new field? So mind those transitions, be humble through those transitions, because sometimes, and I've seen this over and over again, people coming from one field to another, getting into an organization, gun blazing and saying, hey, wait, now I tell you how this is done. And that, for the most part, gets the opposite reaction, where you get rejected like a zit on somebody's nose. So mind those transitions, be humbled, be prepared in those transitions to be, especially if you're a senior in your career, in equal parts a student and teacher, which is it's not an easy balance to find, especially as you grow in age and in experience. And then the last thing is reflecting back, and I'm sure Paul and Pravin will certainly vouch what I say next. A career, successful or otherwise, is never one man's construct, or one woman construct. There is always a network of professional connections that shape ultimately who you are, where you go, and what you achieve. And so, again, be very grateful if you have that network. And if you don't, here is another recommendation, if you want, based on experience: seek to build one out, because you're not going to be able to achieve anything if you do it alone. Voila. So those are my initial thoughts. I see that there are a few questions that have piled up while I was blabbing along, and happy to engage in a conversation.
Great. Thank you for those reflections. Anthony, you also put a peg in the line in the sand to decide that not everything comes your way, and you need to be able to take it as it comes and strike your way through. And all of us have seen that, and the challenges come, especially when you're in a global role, where if you're looking at cultural, socioeconomic influences. So let me bring you to a question which has also popped up with Louise, and we have also struggled ourselves from a success definition point of view. And the first one, it also is one of your questions: how do you get a seat at the table? And at the decision-making table, you talked about the challenge and it happens in all careers, whether it's academic or otherwise. How do you get a seat at the table? And Louise is asking another very pertinent question, that when you look at leadership and you're looking at driving a vision of a company, at least in the biopharmaceutical industry, which is really commercially focused in the past and today is changing gears, how do we quantify the impact which will actually justify, or is there a need to justify our impact, what we could bring to the table at the leadership level? How do you quantify that? What is the challenge? How do you make sure that what we do is really meaningful and purposeful? I'm talking of the medical. So that seat at the table is a challenge we've all faced ourselves. Any reflections at your end?
Yeah, so I'll get started, but I'm sure Paul has his own views on this. Look, sit at the table, you get it two ways. And we have perhaps in the early part of I'm done the same thing. So it's just again another warning. You get a seat at the table because you try to get invited to meetings whichever way you can. But then if you sit through that meeting just because it was important to show up and you contribute absolutely no content to the outcome of the meeting, you can be absolutely certain that you're not going to be invited a second time. Well, maybe a second time and a third time out of pity, but eventually it will run out. No, to have a seat at the table, you have to earn it. And I mean it in the sense of it links back to the, if you are in an organization that is for profit, with all, again, what we said at the beginning, all the moral questions that raises in somebody who's, has a very ethical view of life and purpose, if you don't speak that language, you're never going to be at the table, at the decision-making table. And that's point number one. And point number two is to have a profound awareness of how decisions are made and why decisions are made. Because again, back to the point of, I want to go to the meeting simply because it's important to be there. Well, having a profound understanding of how decisions are made, it guides you, first of all, on whether or not you really need it at that meeting. But if you need it at that meeting, or what is the piece of information that you need to contribute for the decision to be formed. And if you go with that piece of information, I can assure you that you have secured your seat at that table for many meetings to come. So a little bit generic, but I think that's a fundamental truth.
Great point, and I think the difficulty lies in putting an impact factor on what you bring at that table, which is important. So, Paul, any considerations in your experience about how do we measure the impact that we could give? Because that's a challenge.
Yeah, I think there are two parts to this. One is related to your network, and that in some sense your reputation precedes you. That other people know who you are and what your expertise is and what you can contribute. So there's that comes one through having developed mentors and coaches. Coaches really for an acute activity or something where you need some specific help with, that you've worked with them and that you've been able to then close the loop with them, that you're polite in how you've engaged all that and thankful and appropriately appreciative for their contributions, and that it works, so that there's a give and take that goes on. Mentoring is a longer term activity, and people who are higher up in the organization look to mentor people down in the organization. They look to help not just with a specific episode, but really over, several years, over some period of time, to give them guidance and opinions and perspectives and maybe connections that may help them. So you are invited because people are aware of you and what it is that you can contribute. And then there's the two parts, and Antonio just brought them up about being able to speak and being able to write. Can you put, and they're critical, both of them. It's not a single one. You can't be better at one and not at the other. You've got to really up your game in both of them. Being able to speak appropriately at a table, recognize the dynamics, who's in charge, and how opinions are raised, and do you jump in like a bull in a china shop, or do you wait for opportunity to offer your opinion on something or to be asked? And then the speaking, and so that's the speaking part, and also to be able to write a good memo. Know how to write a one-page memo, not 20 pages that no one will read, but a one-page memo, one side, succinctly to make the point, and that memo will shoot its way around the organization. And parts of it will be lifted for other purposes in that. So it doesn't matter that your name is connected to every word or concept on it, but they know where it came from. And they'll want you to be able to contribute because those are valuable skills that you can add.
Praveen, I was reading the Q&A and I saw that the thing on impact is in one of the questions is very much linked to the impact of medical affairs, so which gets my old medical affairs juices going. And so I want to answer I want to translate what I said before more directly as it applies to the impact on medical in the pharma industry, because the misunderstanding and often the disappointing truth that is put in front of medical affairs people by unscrupulous commercial people in the industries to say, well, your impact has to be sales. Yeah, which is both sinister and not true, because the impact of what we do in medical affairs in general is one of changing the way business is done around the medicine. Whether that translates into more or less sales, well, if it translates in more sales, everybody's happy, super happy, you're a hero, whatever. But there are situations in which what we do as medical affairs just allows physicians to use the medicines that are in the marketplace better, in a more effective way. And then eventually that makes its way through to better sales. But, this false dogma that in medical affairs you're there to increase the sales of the company is, it exists, but it is through the lens of having the ability of making people that are on the business side of things reflect on how things can be done differently, and hopefully result in a better income for the company. The other way to look at it is to find ways for those medicines to be adopted by a larger number of people, which is a larger number of patients, which is another way to say more sales. But the humanistic aspect of that is that knowledge contribution brings on board on the use of those drugs a larger number of patients. Yeah.
Great point. I think I'm glad you brought that up. I was trying to round off beyond in medicine development, because there are lots of other functions that come in beyond medical affairs, and that's the reason why I was trying to broaden that whole question. But Louise is asking a very pertinent question. Now, one of the elements that is coming up very strongly, and I've had discussion with Honoré in the past about this, which is a genuine issue we grapple with, that purpose, in fact, could be independent of maybe education, and it exists. And purpose, as you probably are familiar with the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, maybe is that associated with necessarily a formal education and or life's career education along with this, or do you see that as a challenge? So there's a sense of purpose independent of being educated. Now, how do you see in your role this whole discussion around the alignment of purpose, which is an innate value, and the need to be able to go to get further professional qualifications to build on that? Or can you still exist without the two? Paul, any thoughts on that, because you've seen it from both sides?
Yeah, I can tell you that industry is very conservative. I can tell you that academia is even more conservative, and regulators are probably even more conservative than that. So we're talking about very conservative disciplines that impinge on this. People want to see that you have certain level of credentials. They want to see that you've had certain level of productivity. So it's really difficult, I think, to get into it without having at least some degree of that. And I think, again, it's part of why, there is an academy and why there is, any of the other organizations in order to sort of up everybody's game to a certain level. There's a problem, I think, in the US and not having enough training and background of commonality, that there's a shared history, a shared understanding of how things came to be how they are, and how you can fit into that. So yes, I think purpose is great, but if you don't know the background, you don't know the history, and you don't understand how things got to where they are, I think you really run a risk of causing problems. And it's hard to fit in if you don't understand the basic culture.
Yeah, no, so, I'll second that, Praveen. But I'll say two things. So purpose is born out of a combination of things: your education, but also your life experiences, where you come from, what has been important in your early life, et cetera, et cetera. So I think hopefully your education, let's put it this way, hopefully your education aligns with your innate sense of purpose. But I want to say something about purpose, because it's very important, and get scientific and technical for a second. Purpose is if it's true, and if you're true to your purpose, it's a very important motor of what you do. And so you put yourself into a situation where your purpose does not align with what the organization you belong to does. You create something that is called the cognitive dissonance. So this is my moral compass. This is the behavior that I am asked to display, and they don't match with each other. This situation, in very scientific terms, this has been studied over and over again, creates stress. And that stress, if it's not resolved one way or another, eventually becomes destructive to the person and to the people that surround. So you become the toxic member of the team, so to speak. Now, why is that important to reflect for in a second? Because there are two ways to resolve that cognitive dissonance. Progressively, you change not your action, but your moral compass. And you start believing that your purpose has changed. If we believe that this is an innate thing into people, eventually that crashes. The other way to do it is to recognize it and to move on. And I know that's a very difficult thing to do, because especially later in life, there are, image issues involved, financial issues involved, et cetera, et cetera. But there is a lot of literature on cognitive dissonance. And if you want to take it from a scientific point of view, read a little bit of that literature, and you know how potent that construct is in the sense of positive or negative.
a very great point. And when you talk of dissonance, so while success may not necessarily be defined by going up the hierarchy, but you've been able to have sense of accomplishment even where you are. But the point that you bring up here is the reality of life is that there is a dissonance, and that dissonance leads to a stress, and the stress is one that could lead to an influencing factor, a motivating factor, or even a dissuading factor. And so these are challenges we grapple with all the time from the larger business purpose. That's a very great point. Now, I know we are coming close to the hour, and this is a great discussion that we're going on, and you've also already brought up good points around, are you aware of your surroundings? Are you part of the organizational ethos? Before we close this, it would be nice to go around. What do you see, and what do you see as a solution to this? What do you see can be done to improve the situation? What do you see can be as a potential solutions to making sure that there is an inculcation of a sense of purpose, a building of professional identity at the professional level and the educational level? Paul, first stab at it. Any closing thoughts?
Well, it's all at all multiple levels. It's what you think and do, and what you read, and what you write about, and whether it gets published or whether it's something that's into the memos that you write and all that. So how you express yourself, it's how you interact with other individuals, and then when you move up in an organization, it's how those organizations. Or not so much that organization, but the professional organization you're part of. Now, I think Tony mentioned this, very early on, is that your professional community is greater than the job that you're in, is greater than the company you're in, and that network is a horizontal relationship, can cross even across sectors. So your connections, and again, they're more likely to be mentors than they are coaches, but they can be extremely valuable in terms of supporting missions and other nonprofits and other things that are going on. So I think there's lots of ways that it can be expressed, and that you can find satisfaction and reward from.
Yeah.
Tony, any suggested actions?
Yeah, no, I'll say two things. I mean, your question presupposes that there is a problem, which may or may not be the case. It depends on where you identify the problematic aspects of what we are discussing here. But let's say a career, as Paul said, is never a linear journey, and so there are points in time where problems arise. And then for me, the question is, when you're faced with problems at some point, those being, this alignment of purpose, not going as fast as you think you should go, rethinking whether you are in the right industry or structure in general of society, et cetera, what you do. And I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I'm going to tell you the two things that have guided me the most. Number one is, I totally agree with Paul, having good mentors in a moment of darkness, when you lose a little bit your own personal compass. Thank God for those people I could go and talk to, and they would recenter me or re-challenge me and allow me to get a different perspective. The second thing is, and here I'm going to get a little bit brutal, perhaps, to close with my remarks. Be very clear about what you're after. Okay, are you after knowledge? Are you after power? Are you after money? And it seems extremely shrewd, but if you have clarity in your mind about what you're after in your career, and maybe it's a combination of those three in different portions, that gives you a lot of indication of which levers you need to move to go towards your own definition of success. So sorry to finish a little bit on on a very pragmatic note, but I think in my experiences and in my conversation with my teams and my team members, sometimes getting down to the question of what are you really after here has been very, very telling. Thank you.
Exactly, and I think this has been a very humbling experience. Both Paul and Antonio, you've summed it up well in the sense that you need to find your sense of purpose and be comfortable in that, and find your meaning of life. And that's why we started off in the beginning. Ikigai, what do you love doing? What are you good at? What do you get rewarded at? And what do you think the world needs? I think this is a wonderful spirit to close. So I know that it's getting late at the hour in Shanghai and in Australia and people waiting. So, but let me try and round off here that the expression that you unanimously expressed, you expressed the passion, the belief, and the dedication, not only your journey of self-worth, and you've seen some of the questions you brought up. Are you aware of your surroundings? Are you part of the organization ethos? Do you mind the transitions? And this conversation clearly opens the door for more platforms to encourage and champion this dialogue, which offers hope for fostering the critical attributes of both self-worth, the purpose, and professional identity in a more structured delivery and format. It only remains for me to thank the panelists for transforming what could be a vulnerability to both a strength and an inspiration. And I also need to thank the operations team for providing the perfect platform and the engaged audience. You saw some very challenging questions being brought up because everyone's grappling with these ideas and bringing their voice into the conversation. So once again, Paul, Antonio, very, 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 very humbling to have your experience with us and also motivating to open the next chapter. So all of you have a wonderful rest of the day, even as you go about making a difference in all that you do and you seek your self-worth and purpose. Thank you and have a lovely day.
Thank you, Praveen.
Thank you, Praveen.